invented by John Dewey and his friends. They teach step 1 generally. They'll teach the alphabet. Not always, usually. But then they skip step 2 and go directly to step 3, and they teach the child a sight vocabulary. Now, a sight vocabulary, by definition, is teaching children to read whole words without their knowing that the letters stand for anything. As far as they're concerned, the letters are totally arbitrary squiggles with no meaning whatever, arranged in a totally haphazard fashion, you see. So now, that is what a sight vocabulary is. Now, how does a child learn a sight vocabulary? Well, let's take, for example, the word horse. The child is introduced to the word horse. He doesn't know that the letters stand for anything, so the teacher puts a little frame around the word horse and says, see the little horse? He's got to see a picture. You see, because ideographs are pictures, little pictures, none of which look like the things they represent. So H-O-R-S-E does not look like a horse. So how does a child see a horse in that? You know how? Any way he can. So then the teacher realized that it's not enough to just put a frame around the word. So she says, okay, we'll give you lots of picture clues. When the word horse is introduced, there are lots of pictures of horses, so the child guesses that the word must be horse. And then they also give the child context clues. They'll use, for example, because they can't always have pictures of horses every time they use the word horse, so they use the word in context so that the child will guess what it says. For example, the man put the saddle on, and the child will guess, well, it could be a camel, it could be a donkey, but it's probably a horse. And then they also teach the child phonetic clues. See, all of these teachers in America who teach the look-say method, they'll tell you, oh, we teach phonics. We teach phonics. But they don't. They teach phonetic clues. What are phonetic clues? They will teach the child that if the word begins with H, it couldn't possibly be bologna or barbecue. It can be hotel, house, hovel, hearse, or horse. So they reduce the ridiculousness of the guess. As a matter of fact, Professor Kenneth Goodman, the leading professor of reading in the United States, calls reading a psycholinguistic guessing game. Because that's what the kids are doing, they're guessing all the time. So that's what a sight vocabulary is, and that's how they teach children to read. And naturally, if you're going to be taught to read that way, you're not going to learn to read very well or very accurately. But Dr. Dearborn says, the principle which we have used to explain the acquisition of a sight vocabulary is, of course, the one suggested by Pavlov's well-known experiments on the conditioned response. This is as it should be. The basic process involved in conditioning and in learning to read is the same. You see, that's why they'll teach go, 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 I go, 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 instead of teaching go, no, so, do, ho. You see, which phonetic in an alphabetic phonics way, you learn a whole lot of words with the O. But in this stupid method, this slow, ridiculous method, they just go, 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 go on. So he's saying the basic process involved in conditioning and in learning to read is the same. In other words, we teach children to read in America as if they were dogs. Now, I believe there is a bit of a difference between a child and a dog. After all, when a dog enters the first grade, what can a dog say? Arf, arf, right? And let us assume that our little canine friend is then socially promoted right through to the 12th grade, as so many youngsters are these days, reaches that momentous occasion at graduation, trots up to the podium to receive his diploma, holds out his paw, looks up into the eyes of the principal, and what can that poor little doggy say? Arf, arf. In 12 years, that poor little dog hasn't learned a single word. But a human child enters the first grade with a speaking vocabulary between 5,000 and 35,000 words. Isn't that amazing? Every child teaches himself to speak his own language. virtually from birth, so that by the time he's ready to go to school, he's mastered his auditory and verbal skills to such a high degree that he's got a speaking vocabulary of thousands and thousands of words. And he's done it all by himself. Isn't that amazing? You see, every child is a dynamo of language learning. Why? Because God made him that way. You see, God gave us the power of language. He did not give it to any of the other species. He didn't give it to the animals. And of course, this upsets the behavioral psychologists quite a bit. So they're going to try to say, well, you're all a bunch of animals, and so they call human language, they poo-poo human language, they say, oh, don't make such a fuss over human language. What else is it? It's just verbal behavior, that's all it is. It's just an evolutionary development from animal talk. It's a little more complicated way of saying bow wow, meow, chirp chirp. That's all it is. As a matter of fact, they're convinced that the reason why monkeys don't speak is because they've been culturally deprived. So they've actually experimented by having monkeys live among human families to see if they would learn to speak. But I'm afraid the poor little monkeys haven't done much better than our little canine friend in school. See, only human beings have the power of speech. Now, why? Well, you see, God created us in His image, and He wanted to have a means of communicating with us. And so He gave us the power of the Word, because what does it say in the Bible? It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So there's something very special about the Word, and He gave human beings the power of the Word. And incidentally, the alphabet was invented about 2,000 years B.C. Prior to that, man used an ideographic form of writing. You've seen Egyptian hieroglyphics. Modern Chinese is an ideographic writing system. They have 50,000 of those little squigglies, none of which look like anything they represent. They're little pictures of ideas. See, at the beginning, when all this began, they first used pictography. The cavemen drew little pictures on the walls of the caves. And you didn't have to go to school to learn to read those pictures. You know, a man looked like a man, an animal looked like an animal, a bow and arrow looked like a bow and arrow. But as civilization became more complex, the scribes had to begin drawing pictures of things that did not look like the things they represented. I mean, how do you know, it's easy enough to draw a picture of a man, but how do you draw a picture of an idea? How do you draw a picture of good and evil? You see. How do you draw a picture of system or method? How do you draw a picture of determination? How do you draw a picture of method? You can't, so what do? You draw a little picture and you say, this stands for method. It doesn't look like method, but it stands for method. And so they created thousands and thousands of little pictures, none of which look like anything that they represented. And so now some of you had to go to school and learn thousands and thousands of these little symbols. And then around 2,000 years B.C., somebody made a remarkable discovery. Somebody discovered that all of human language is composed of a small number of irreducible speech sounds. And so that individual said, instead of using this cumbersome system of little squigglies and pictures, none of which look like anything they represent or require years and years to master, why don't I create a small set of symbols to stand for the irreducible speech sounds of the language, and then we will have a very simple way of transcribing the spoken word into written form, and an equally simple way of translating the written word back into spoken form, and so the first alphabet was invented. Now, English, of course, how many irreducible speech sounds do you think are on the English language? We have a vocabulary approaching 1 million words. How many irreducible speech sounds do you think are on in English? Does anybody want to volunteer? Anyone read my book? Want to volunteer? Right, 44 sounds. Only 44 sounds in English. Isn't that wonderful? But you see, now you might ask, well, we have a 26-letter alphabet. How come? How did that happen? Well, what happened was when the Romans conquered the British Islands, they imposed the Latin alphabet on the people who lived there, and the people who lived there adapted the Latin alphabet to their needs. And so our alphabetic system is a little more complex than others because some of our letters stand for more than one sound, and some of our sounds are represented by more than one letter. But we've managed to produce the world's greatest literature with our English alphabetic system. Children have learned to read by it for centuries without any problems. And of course, something else of great importance occurred when the alphabet was invented. The scripture began to appear. You see, mankind had to wait until he had a precise, accurate means of transcribing the spoken word directly into written form before the Word of God could be put on paper. Precision and accuracy are the hallmarks of alphabetic writing. That's not so of ideographic writing. I'll give you an illustration. We use lots of ideographs today in America. You've seen them. International airports, little pictures on doors, you know. Now, you've seen the little sign, the circle with the cigarette and the slash through it, haven't you? Now, when you see that one, you say, oh, gee, I can't smoke. I may not light up. No smoking permitted. Nicht rauchen. Défense de fumer. No fumar. Thou shalt not smoke. But the sign that says no smoking, that's all it says. It represents two spoken words. No smoking. Doesn't say anything else. So that's the precision and accuracy of alphabetic writing as opposed to the inaccuracy of an ideograph. So that's why it's so important. That's what makes the crucial difference between our writing system and an ideographic one. If you teach children to read by this same method, you create inaccurate readers. I've trained many of these readers. I know how they read. They read along, but you find that they leave out words that are there. They put in words that aren't there. Oh, they're editing and rewriting as they go along, you see. Then they guess words that they, not quite sure of. And of course, then they do something very interesting. They truncate words. They'll see a word like telephone and they'll say phone. They'll see a word like newspaper and they'll say paper. It says newspaper that they see paper. They don't see newspaper, they see paper. So they become very inaccurate readers. Now here is Dr. Pearson, Dearborn, telling us that we teach children to read English as if they were dogs. As I explained, a human being comes to school, a child comes to school with this enormous language learning energy, which Dewey discounted. He was interested in their motor, their little motorboats. That's what he was interested in. Go, go, go. That's where they use the verb of go, go. That's where they get it from. But now here's our little Johnny. He's ready to go to school. This is the way they teach reading these days. And he's taught himself to speak his own language. Very intelligent. You know how these kids feel at that age. They feel very intelligent. You know why? They are intelligent. When a 5-year-old teaches himself to speak his own language, he feels very intelligent. So here's this youngster. He ends his school and he's ready to learn to read. He says, gee, I taught myself to speak my own language. I certainly can learn to read. But his teacher is using the Dick and Jane reading program. And he's going to be taught to read by sight. And so this is what he's taught to read in the first grade by his teacher, by sight. Dick, look, Jane. Look, look. See Dick. See. Oh, see. See Dick. Oh, see Dick. Oh. Funny Dick. This little youngster sits there and he says to himself, gee, either I'm crazy or she's crazy. And what's this? Oh, look, see. That's not the way people talk. This is ridiculous. This school's a weird place. But Mother has told me to behave myself, to do the best I can, and I certainly will try. But at the end of the year, he's not doing well at all. You see, he's one-third identified by Dr. Orton as those who have problems learning to read this way. Why? Well, he may have great auditory and verbal skills, but his visual skills are not so hot. You see, he doesn't have a photographic memory. So he's going to have problems. And at the end of the year, he's having terrible problems. And mother is called to school and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny has a reading problem. We shall have to keep him back a year. And so here's Johnny, who felt so intelligent in September. By June, he's saying to himself, gee, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Maybe I'm dumb. And then at the end of the second year, things don't improve. As a matter of fact, they get worse. And mother is called to school again and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny has a learning disability. Johnny is dyslexic. We shall have to put him in special education. And so now mother is thinking, my God, have I given birth to a defective child? What's wrong with Johnny? And so he's taken to doctors and psychiatrists and, and he's tested and retested, and they're all trying to find out what's wrong with Johnny. Maybe it's minimal brain damage, brain dysfunction, neurological impairment, attention deficit syndrome. That must be it, attention deficit syndrome. Or, they're trying to find what's wrong with him, and they think, oh no, maybe it's an allergy. Maybe he's eating too many Twinkies, drinking too much Pepsi-Cola. They're all concerned with what's wrong with Johnny, not what's wrong with the way they're teaching in the schools, but what's wrong with Johnny. And by now, Johnny is going around saying, I'm stupid, I can't learn, I'm dyslexic. He's already resigned himself to his new status, you see. And mother, of course, is frantic, and she doesn't know what to do, so she just goes along with the educators who put this poor youngster in special ed. And after a year in special ed, what do you think happens? He becomes a behavioral problem. Johnny is now swinging from the rafters. You see, in addition to being taught to read by this ridiculous method, he's been told that he's a little animal, a product of evolution, and he's been taken to the zoo to see his cousins, the monkeys, and to say hello to his uncle, the gorilla. And he sees them swinging from the bars, and he said to himself, I can swing too. So there he goes swinging. And so mother is called to school again, after being informed that her son is a little monster. And so, Mrs. Jones, if Johnny is to remain in school, he will have to take medication. And so back to the psychiatrist they go, and of course they recommend their favorite behavioral modification drug known as Ritalin. And in a very short time, our little Johnny is reduced to a little zombie in the classroom, destined to a life as a functional illiterate. Now that scenario is going on all over America, in every school district, in every state. It's now the biggest business in America. Creating functional illiteracy, creating special education, which is now funded by the federal government by the billions, and now drugging the kids. You see, this method works wonders. You see, what this method of teaching does is stop the learning process. As I said, this child comes to school with tremendous learning energy, language learning energy, and what this method of teaching does is it brings that whole process to a screeching halt. So the child is there with all this learning energy that's in the brain and it has no outlet, and so it comes out in physical form. He becomes hyperactive. He becomes a victim of attention deficit syndrome. Well, now they've got to have a way to deal with these kids who can't sit still. So what do? They now drug them. I tell you, the schools have got it down to a science. They know how to do it. They are deceiving millions of parents, destroying the minds of millions of children. See, what's happening to that child is that the educators, the teachers, are performing a non-surgical prefrontal lobotomy on the kids. See, they're removing the brain. Why? Well, to behavioral psychologists, the brain is not very important. It gets in the way of things. They only are concerned about behavior. And so they've got to get rid of the brain. That's why some of these kids come out of school and you call them airheads. You heard of Airhead? Nothing up there. As a matter of fact, what happens to many of these kids is they go into school having learned to read, having been taught by their parents at home, and in a year's time they can no longer read. I've had that told to me by parents. They teach their child to read at home before going to school, and a year of this look-say stuff, and the child can't read anymore. And he regresses. His language no longer develops, his speech no longer develops, and all you have to do is listen to today's young adults to know what has been done to their speech. They can't even speak anymore. And now we're actually graduating youngsters from American schools with no employable skills. We're creating a new underclass. A new underclass, particularly in the inner cities, among the blacks and the Hispanics. These are youngsters, all of whom have spent 8 to 12 years in school and have emerged at the end of the process with no employable skills. They know nothing. They can't read, they can't write, they can't add, they can't think, they can't even speak their own language anymore. Can you imagine spending 12 years in school and coming out knowing nothing? That's quite an achievement, isn't it? You see, our schools are now so efficient in destroying young people that they can actually do it and get away with it and blame it on the kids and then blame it on you. Oh, it's the parents' fault. It's the taxpayer. You're not willing to spend enough money, you see. Oh, they'll blame you all the time. Matter of fact, in the last few weeks, that's all we've heard of, these sob stories about how, how miserly the Reagan administration has been. Well, I did a newsletter, one of my newsletters on how the federal government squanders billions on education. The U.S. government started funding public education in 1965 with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. They had, Chapter 1, or Title 1 of that act was Education of Disadvantaged Children. They said, well, we've got to take these poor kids from the ghettos and give them an extra push. And so they created Title 1. Do you know how much money has been spent on Title I? Between 1966 and 1986? $49 billion, $745 million. That's just one program. And what has been the result? We have worse problems today than ever. You mean that isn't enough money? That isn't enough money to give these kids an education? 49 billion, almost 50 billion. By now it's more. If you add the figures for 1987 and 88, it goes over $50 billion. That's just one program. You see how they're fooling us. And of course, it's so political now that the NEA virtually controls many state legislatures. They get everything they want. There are more teachers now in many state legislatures than lawyers. They're involved in municipal elections, school board elections, state legislative elections, presidential elections, congressional elections. The NEA and its affiliates collect $500 million a year in dues, most of which goes for political activity. So you're talking of a system that is now so efficient and so powerful. How can we fight this? How can we fight something as horrendous as this? How can we save these little Johnnies from this misery, from being destroyed? How can we do it? Well, I'll tell you the truth. Apart from going around the country speaking and trying to wake people up, the NEA isn't very worried about me. You see, it's very hard for me to get on the national networks or to get time on television, national television, or in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. You know why? Because what I'm telling you is too unbelievable. There's a credibility problem. See, the businessmen know that there's something wrong in American education. For example, David Kearns, the president of Xerox Corporation, recently denounced the schools as a failed monopoly with a 50% defect rate. And then he said businesses must hire workers who can't read, write, or count, and then spend $25 million a year to train them. Well, now when you go to Mr. Kearns and you try to convince him why this is happening and why the reform hasn't amounted to beans, and you know we've had all of this reform now since the Nation at Risk in 1983 report. Here it is 1988, and they're all bemoaning. What happened to the reform? Where's the improvement? And in the neighboring state here of Washington, the verbal SAT scores have declined from 1980 to 87, declined 21 points. Last year alone, the verbal score declined 6 points. And that's supposed to be a great liberal progressive state where, you know, they fund education. Incidentally, the educators have warned us of worse things to come. See, they know that things are going to get worse, so they're preparing us. They held a meeting on June 1st in Washington last year, at the end of which they put out an announcement of academic disaster ahead. I happened to be in Tucson, Arizona on June 2nd, and that story made the front page headline of the Tucson Citizen. I don't know if it made the headlines in any other newspaper in America, but this is what it said. It said, young failures call peril to U.S., unproductive children term drain on society. Washington, as many as 1/3 of the nation's 40 million school-aged children are at serious risk of failing in school and society, which would create massive, urgent problems for the nation, leaders of 11 education groups warned yesterday. Their coalition, known as the Forum of Educational Organization Leaders, said this potentially huge number of unproductive citizens will drain the economy in welfare and social service costs and seriously hamper the nation's ability to compete internationally. Well, they're telling us, we're going to give you lots more failure. It's not interesting. You know, supposing the managers, the directors of the General Motors Corporation went before their stockholders and told them, we plan to produce massive numbers of lemons in the years ahead. What do you think the stockholders would do to the management? They'd get rid of them, wouldn't they? But here the educational leaders of America are telling us that they intend that they're going to produce, that we must expect massive numbers of academic lemons in the years ahead, and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, why is this going to happen? Well, there's either of two reasons. Either they are totally incompetent and cannot produce academic excellence, or they have no intention of producing academic excellence. It has to be one or the other. Now, if they're incompetent and can't produce it, shouldn't they say, look guys, we've tried very hard, we can't do it, we're going to step down and let somebody else do it? No. They're saying we can't do it, but we intend to stay in place. But if they do not intend to produce academic excellence, then they are deceiving and defrauding the public, and they should be put in jail. So that's what they've done to the great nation of America. We're now the laughing stock of the world. This great nation is spending all this money on education, and we have children coming out unable to read and write. And it's all the result of a political decision made by the educators as far back as 1898. You have to understand that whole political picture. Education is completely politicized in America today. They have no intention of producing anything but that socialist utopia that they still believe in. If you don't think the humanists believe in that socialist utopia, you haven't read many humanist publications. They still believe in this nonsense. They still believe that they can even produce it. Of course, now they're going to do it with the help of the Soviet Union. We're going to get that wonderful merger. You've heard of the Soviet-American education. So that's what we're up against. Now, how do you deal with this? How do we conservatives, how do Christians deal with such an incredible situation? Well, you've got to do the same kind of analysis that Dewey did. Dewey analyzed his enemy